The year-on-year inflation rate for the month of October has reached 40.4%, with the increase in food prices as the main driver. Food inflation recorded the highest rate among all the components as against non-food inflation, according to the Ghana Statistical Service. Now, the increase in food inflation indicates a jump of more than 3% from the previous rate of 37.2%. Joy Business's George Ruffett joins me live for details. George, can you please give us highlights of what is pushing our inflation?
Well, if you go through the numbers that the Ghana Statistical Service actually released today, what they were trying to talk about was the major driver being the food group of numbers.
Yeah.
So if you look at the numbers again, you realize that if you look at the food group, the contribution was quite significant here. If you look at the numbers, for instance, that the Statistical Service itself has released, if you put all the food component calculation together, you're looking at a situation where on the year-on-year angle, it went up by 43.7%. That is the food aspect of it if you look at the numbers.
Yeah.
Now, that is an increase from 37.8% in the same month last year. So if you look at the major drivers here, we are looking at the food component of the basket that is driving this. Now, let's get to another very, very, very important point that there's been a lot of debate about it, and based on the numbers so far. Also, if you look at the another driver or what is pushing the numbers up, the items produced locally or the food items produced locally contributed about 39.1%.
And do we know why?
So just let me...
Sure.
And
Continue.
then also, when we come to the imported inflation bit, it was 43.7%. And let me go over it again. The domestic inflation bit, in terms of the drivers or the food that was produced locally, was 39.1%. Now, the imported inflation was 43.7%. So it appears that the bit about the transportation, the bit about the fuel, was a major contributory factor when it comes to the local food items and their impact on inflation. And also, the import inflation bit is not just about the things being expensive, but the cedi's depreciation is also a factor. So you need more Ghana cedis to get that same quantity of goods that is being brought from Durban or Pretoria or Manten to Accra. And that is what is also feeding to the import inflation bit as well. If items are expensive, and that is one thing some people don't want to hear, the Russian-Ukrainian issue and how that is impacting on fuel and other items, that is driving inflation locally. So remember that recently there was a comment by the IMF Africa boss about whether indeed import inflation was a big issue. Well, what the data that is telling us right now from the Ghana Statistical Service suggests that import inflation is a major driver of what we are seeing, the 40.4% for the month of October 2022.
All right, as we're heading into the festive season, many people will be buying food stuff. What does this mean? The 40.4%, what does this mean for the ordinary Ghanaian, for me and you?
So inflation is not, some would say, is not a futuristic thing.
Okay.
Inflation is measuring something that has happened already.
Sure.
You might be able to use these numbers to do your extrapolations and whether we have peaked or not. So you're looking at last year, October, 2021, we've seen a growth on this by 40.4%. That is huge. Let's come to month on month. And something interesting is happening because these numbers look at the year on year and the month on month.
I see.
From September to October, it has gone up by 2.7%. That is interesting. Breaking away from the previous slowdown that we saw when you look at the month-on-month inflation. It is telling us that things are peaking again. What were the drivers? The import inflation. Don't forget that transport fares have gone up. Fuel prices have gone up. So all these things are feeding into the general price levels of goods and services. And they might give us some indication that the hikes in prices that we're seeing might not be ending soon. You asked the question about, and so what? Why should I care? Inflation is the biggest thief or the biggest robber. It means that it has divided your money that you're holding right now. The 10 cedis the same period in October last year, you have lost about 40.4% of what that value can purchase. So if it was getting you maybe 10 tubers of yam, roughly, last year, that value has dropped by this percentage. And therefore, that money that you're holding cannot get you that. Your investments as well, people are talking about investment in banks and all the rest. This inflation thing has robbed that value of it. So it means that your value of your returns on your investments in these various tools and banks and all the rest has been wiped up because of this significant spike in inflation as well. And don't forget that it could also impact on the cost of credit.
Yeah. Because
when the banks are lending to you as well, they want to look at how they can price the lending so they also don't lose out.
Yeah.
And this inflation bit is feeding to the value of our currency and the depreciation as well, because then people now think that, okay, if my value is being robbed, then should I look at an alternate currency where I can try and hedge against the inflation, because the inflation here is robbing that 50,000 that you're holding last year. It cannot get you the same quantity of goods or things that you're doing. So a rational human being, even though some might say that it's not good, raise all sort of arguments against it, would want to take steps to minimize the shocks or the losses to his currency. And that is why some might want to rush and get dollars. And when there are not enough dollars in the system, that is fueling the city's depreciation.
Thank you very much. That is Assisting Editor George Urafi, who is with Joy Business. Increased food prices push inflation to 40%. Still on food, Minister for Food and Agriculture, Dr. Owusu Afriyie-Okoto, says the high cost of transportation is not to blame for soaring food prices inflation for October, which is more than 40%, driven largely by food and transportation prices. Answering questions in Parliament, the minister said the analysis of the ministry does not point to transportation costs as the cause of the hikes, although he did not point out what exactly is causing the increase, which we know that is food. Also, the minister also defended his ministry's plans to bring food from the local areas to Accra in order to compete with the high cost of food on the market. We'll speak to our parliamentary correspondent, Kweku Asante, there. Thank you very much, George, for that analysis.